through the same thing as everybody else. We have ACEs, the adverse childhood effects scores. And some of us, even have 10 out of 10. And we're still doing our healing work simultaneously as teaching and helping our fellow humans to do healing work. And in that vein, I almost visualize like this rebel ragtag band of people who have survived hundreds of years of intentional colonization and assimilation, who are tattered and scarred, coming out of this and doing the work. And then the generations after us will be able to do the work without that trauma load that we have experienced ourselves. So there we go. There's a good intro.
Thank you. That's important history that you've consolidated. We could go into that. A book could be written, many books, and thank you for bringing that together. I'd like to talk a little bit about your weaving of traditional agricultural methods with, such as the potato project you've been working on, and this push towards agriculture as we face climate change.
Yeah, thank you. Well, climate change is a reality, as we know. And even, 6 years ago, it wasn't common knowledge. Like, that veil had not been pierced into the illusion that we carry as Americans or in advanced Western cultures. There was an intentional, I guess illusion is just the best way to say. There was this intentional illusion that capitalism and consumerism and this process of growing economies exponentially was sustainable. And we knew at contact that it was not sustainable. Wilson Justin, he talks about how the elders said at contact, that's when we went out of balance. That's when climate change started, because our relationships with the plants and the animals and the spiritual world and each other went out of balance. So this is a very predictable outcome in an Indigenous lens. But in a Western, patriarchal, ego-based lens, it was something that's being ignored or swept under the rug intentionally in the collective consciousness, because it's something that they didn't want to believe and felt that if they, if I don't see you, you can't see me, kind of thinking. So as we move forward, there's a lot of things that have to be done. Our traditional medicine and story people, they've said before, even I was born, and the medicine people even now, that the way to make it through these events is through holding on to each other, taking care of each other, and stewarding the land. And that's both forward thinking, intermediate thinking, and past thinking, because our timeline traditionally was not linear. It's circular, cyclical, and building on itself. And in this concept, we've had climate change before. Many of our people have been here well over 10,000 years and even over 20,000 years. And some even have stories that go back to, saber-toothed tigers. So there's this knowledge that the climate does change. There's also this knowledge that the environment is going to be out of balance, and it's going to result in crashing populations of plants and animals and humans and mass disruption of this harmony. So the working with plants as food and medicine and the cultivation of plants stems from that knowledge and also that concept of being able to work from a place of control or autonomy. And not that we can control the whole system, but we can control what is around us. We are the influencers in our own life. So the traditional way of being was cultivating natural systems to increase and augment abundance. And that abundance helped to feed the plants, the animals, the insects, the birds, the fish, and humans, as well as creating enough abundance for trade outside of our spaces. And that trade and the abundance sharing creates overlapping circles of distribution. So if you think of traditional economy, they're overlapping circles of distribution and sharing of goods and services that may not be available in your space. So for instance, interior areas have less access to high-grade oils. The coast has an abundance to high-grade marine oils. So we had thousands of miles in Shingaani of grease trails where we carry bentwood boxes of rendered ooligan grease or rendered seal grease or other fats interior that we would trade for other things, right? But that occurred because there was enough fish population, there was enough food for the people there, everybody was cared for, and then traded inland. So our plants are significant. Dr. Rita Blumenstein talked about how as climate changes, our plants are going to change with it, and we're going to have to start adapting plants from ecoregions below us and bringing them into spaces where we're at. And it's important that our medicine people or our traditional healers communicate to each other and find out what are the cornerstone species, which ones are the cornerstone relatives to the other plants and animals that have to be brought into that space, but that also play well, which means that they're not super invasive, that's going to take over a space. And that is a traditional construct of sharing knowledge. Our medicine people had a currency of sharing knowledge with each other. Intellectual property had more value pre-contact. Our songs, our stories, our crests, our medicine knowledge, it all carried value. And our medicine people, that was part of their exchange, was knowledge and planting of plants and use of plant medicine. And we augmented and stewarded natural systems. So for us, if we're operating on that wisdom that is cyclical and works in these cycles and has worked before, then we carry it forward to work now and we share with people so it can also work again in the future. And by propagating specific plants, we increase the amount of food that's available. Right now, we have a lot of people who are enthusiasts who want natural, high-grade plants for their health benefits and for their food benefits, and people wild harvest, which is beautiful. However, we have 7.5 billion people on the planet. If we all go out and wild harvest right now, we will extinguish those plant populations around our population bases. And around the world. We'll basically create a collapse in those ecosystems. And we're seeing it here in Alaska, people, not harvesting bulk kelp correctly. They pull it out by the roots. And then all of a sudden, guess what? The bulk kelp is gone. People harvesting Devil's Club, the full stalk and the rhizome roots. And they may take the mother stalk. And if you take the mother stalk, the whole colony dies. Right? Every single plant has its roles. And by propagating them with intention, then you're increasing the amount that's available and filling that desire for those specific foods. And by propagating them intentionally in our yards, two things happen. One, you're replacing the invasives or the other plants that would hold those spaces, that are perennials, you just look nice, or annuals that just look nice, but don't serve a purpose. So you're increasing the indigenous plant population in the yards, and it helps to support indigenous pollinators. One of the challenges that we're looking at is the collapse of the honeybee. The honeybee is adorable and fuzzy, and I love it. I'd like it to stay around, but it is something that has come from Europe that was brought to the United States, and it displaced our indigenous pollinators. So when the honeybee population collapsed, because it's a monoculture, right? It's just one large body of production without a lot of genetic variation. And they live in colonies that then get mites or are affected by pesticides, viruses, molds, everything can affect them. If that crashes, then we lose our pollination system because our indigenous pollinators have been pushed out. So by propagating indigenous plants, you're helping to support the indigenous pollinators. And so that's, the level of the ecosystem. You're increasing and safeguarding what's there. You're providing more nutrients to humans who want to increase their health and get closer to nature. You're supporting the insects and the natural pollinators. You're also helping to support the local animal stock. I mean, we have things, for instance, like chokecherries or mayday trees. Those are poisonous to moose. And not only are they in our communities, and they're starting to wild propagate out in nature because birds eat the berries and then poop them out, in the forest. And so our moose populations are detrimentally affected by these invasive plants. And so forth. We have the DOT brought in bird vetch, and right now we have bird vetch that are choking out all sorts of our plants along roadsides and banks. And the problem with that is those plants help to safeguard against erosion. They also help to filter the water that travels through that space. And they also help to capture dust so that dust doesn't get into forests, along with the other benefits that we talked about. So by propagating these things, we're anchoring ourselves into a space, and this is for future generations, but I was watching that movie with, oh gosh, what's his name? He goes to Mars and he plants potatoes, and he cites some crazy law that if you plant agrarian plants in a place, then that's a way of claiming that you have discovered and you are now anchored in a space, and that you now own that space. And at that point, I decided that I'm going to plant plants everywhere. So I have plants in spaces that have been, I worked with the Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium and the Alaska Native Hospital, and we had Kelly Bellatine, who was doing a master's degree with APU, and he wanted to put in a traditional plant garden in the courtyard, but he didn't have all the traditional plants, and I did. So I got to plant plants in the courtyard in the heart of our Alaska Native Hospital here in Anchorage. And I've been able to plant plants at APU and places for UAA. I've planted plants down at the old IHS hospital. I have a traditional garden that we put in with the Alaska Native Heritage Center, and sent seeds all over the state and helped to even provide plants for traditional activities like culture camps. So Monty Rogers does culture camps, and he's non-native, but he's an anthropologist and he has enough knowledge, and he works as a good relative. So a lot of tribes actually hire him. And so he needed masu, or Indian potato root, Hedysarum alpinium. And I had some. I had enough that he could do a traditional cache and storage. And so learning those traditional activities actually requires having the traditional plants as well. And maintaining our history. You referenced the Tlingit potato. So there's two items that have that connotation. One is the Hedysarum alpinium, which is the root, which some people call it Indian potato. That is a root that's found in the wild all over that's cultivated. And then there is the ouzette, Tlingit and Haida potato. And that was actually traded for all the way down into Central America. It never went to Spain. It never went to Europe, nowhere else. It was traded for straight down the coast up and into Shingaani. And that has been cultivated for at minimum 800 years in South Central or Southeast Alaska. And it almost went away, but they found it in a couple of gardens. One is called Maria's Potatoes. So Maria from Kasan, she had some. And then Nora Downhauer, the Downhauer's garden had some. My friend Steve Johnson, his family had some in a traditional plot in Southeast. I also got some potatoes from Eleanor Hayden. I actually got potatoes from Steve Johnson and Eleanor Hayden and started propagating them here. And now, I just got a handful of potatoes, and now I have a tote full of potatoes and enough to cut up and do a small plot, maybe even like a quarter of an acre of potatoes. Simultaneously, there's other people who are seeing that it can be done, and they've been planting them as well. Watching, Southeast, the school district planted them already. So everybody's watching people in Southeast, and then they're trying them out here. And Southeast has been revitalizing them probably for 8 years at minimum, or 10 years from that collective knowledge that they exist to full propagation. And then up here, it's now been just the last couple of years that we've brought them into South Central area. So it's this collective movement of revitalizing traditional plants as food and medicine. We're not going to get rid of the agrarian plants that we use predominantly in our stores because they're just such high yield things. The amount of root vegetables you can get from carrots and turnips and, all those different plants are considerable, and they help to feed large populations. So I don't think that we should get rid of those, but I do think that everybody should be growing these foods and medicines in their gardens and learning the knowledge associated with them and share it with our non-native relatives. That's part of this adaptation and survival, is helping to impart this idea of what it means to be Indigenous to the non-Indigenous people, because that is imparting how to be in right relationship with the land and the community. And there's, some hard translation because some people see culture just as the physical representation of culture, just the clothes, the songs, the dances, the things that you can see. And not understanding that the deeper roots of culture, the values and protocols, are what's needing to have that uptake in these larger groups and communities. And I think that learning the local language, even by non-native people, like whatever land you're on, helping to learn some of that local language is really important, because then it helps to start framing this worldview of the traditional Indigenous people, and in a way that's not co-opting, but in a way that's helping to support and perpetuating that relationship.
Thank you. We're on a journey of reclaiming, revitalizing, indigenizing. What are some resources that you'd like to share for those who are seeking connection to plant knowledge, to traditional ecological knowledge?
Oh, goodness. That's a good question, and it's very broad. I would say that for the people who are listening to this, look locally. What is the tribe doing? And can you volunteer and support those efforts? There's also different books available, and now there's more Indigenous people writing books about plant medicine. There was a period of time where all the books we had were just written by non-native people who collected native knowledge. And so supporting that, the books that are written from Indigenous perspective is really important, as well as I love that they help to catalog traditional knowledge. Some of those books are the first books that I read. there's a lot of things going on in the internet, but I would say spending time with elders, having tea with elders, doing yard work for elders, spending time with elders, which is our living libraries, is very important because it helps to honor that tradition. And in that end of life, that's when you're the developmental stage, when you're sharing story and knowledge and passing things on. That was a big part of my learning, was spending time with my grandpa, Ralph Ernest Weiser II, and spending time with Dr. Rita Blumenstein, and spending time with other elders in the communities, is how I gain some of the most significant knowledge that I get to use. Then I augment it with the books, with the college, educational system, with the internet, with videos. And one of the ways that I work, and I suggest people find some version of this, is Indigenous research. So right now we have Story, which Jennifer Andrulli is an ethno researcher, and cataloging this information that's really valuable, but also helps a person learn as they go through it. And then spending time with real people, living people that can impart wisdom, because there's knowledge, but then there's also that knowledge applied in real context, which creates wisdom. And then doing the lit reviews. And when you're reading those texts that were written by explorers, you have to remember the frame or filter that is on those texts. So remember that there's patriarchy. Remember that there's colonization. Remember that there's religion. Remember that there is also the lack of scientific or empirical knowledge. For instance, there was one researcher I was reading, and he was talking about Tlingit taboos, and the taboos that we had, and these, we have these scratchers, and the personal scratchers are to scratch an itch, and it does two things. One, you have to intentionally be conscious of your body and in your body in connection to know that you have an itch to be scratched. And so instead of just mindlessly scratching something, you have your scratcher and you scratch it. That's one. It's part of that internal discipline. Two, we also didn't have regular running water in the house. And so, by scratching, you can actually infect your skin. And I've read some things by elders talking about introducing, bad spirits into the skin. But it's a weird translation, because that bad spirit meant virus, bacteria, right? That's what they meant when they were talking about it. But the explorer wrote it off as taboos, and it really bothered me. And at the time I was in nursing classes, and I had realized that in Europe, they understood the vector of disease and transmission because they were working on cadavers in the hospitals in the basement. And then they were going up to the second floor and delivering babies. And so they were working on dead people, and then they were putting their hands, in the vagina and on of these women having in labor and delivering babies. And there was this high rate of death of women from birth, from child and for infection. And they didn't even use the word infection, they got fevers and died. And so at that time, one of the doctors had realized that the doctors who had washed their hands after working on cadavers and delivering babies had less death rate than the ones who didn't. And so they realized this case study analysis, and so made it implemented that everybody had to wash their hands after working on the cadavers and then delivering the babies. And that's within a 10-year time period after this explorer wrote, these taboos of not scratching our skin or these hygiene practices that we had that he labeled as taboos. So that's a framework that you have to realize that you're reading these through. So you add that with living knowledge, science, research, and these accounts, and then you can build a more rounded view and model of the information and context.
I'd like you to list a few of the keystone plants. Without going into detail, this is the last question, and we just have a few more minutes. And so this will be research for anyone in the future listening to our conversation. Keystone plants for South Central Alaska.
That we should move into South Central Alaska, or that live in South Central Alaska?
Either.
Okay, so it's a boreal forest, and the black spruce is a keystone plant for the boreal forest. However, with climate change, it's becoming too warm, and we don't have our traditional burning. So that's something that we need to actively steward to help protect in this space. Another keystone plant, I was going to say one other one, but I keep seeing this picture, is valerian. Valerian loves to live in South Central and is incredibly important in reducing anxiety and helping to aid in negotiations or peace talks. It also helps with sleep. And so valerian is a keystone species. We also have Artemisia talisii. That's a keystone species. It's a panacea for healing and health and wellness for people. And I also say willow. And I don't know why I'm keeping this to 4 because there's many, many more. But willow is an important food source for many of the herbivores that live in and around South Central Alaska. So it's also part of the salix family and has salicylic acid in it, which is the original aspirin. So all of those are used for medicine. Some of those are used for food, and some of those can be used for food and medicine and textiles and tools. I would say another keystone plant would be nettle. And I know I said 4, but just kind of rounding out that plant family, because nettle is a textile and as well as medicine and food, and it can actually be eaten by itself. If you had to survive off of it, it's a full protein. So we have, I think those plants right there, even if that's all that you worked with, you would cover most of the needs in the community.
Thank you. And any final words?
We are here to be good relatives, to take care of each other and to steward the land. But that also means taking care of ourselves and being responsible for our spiritual journey. We're facing existential crisis of going extinct, and the way through it is by culminating as a human identity and collective and family, and working as our larger tribe or community to make our way through this. And I'm hoping that you're listening to this in 100 years and that we've made it through, and that our future is bright and abundant.
Kriana.
Binchish.